This one's called The Art of Savagery. I was once walking along minding my own indigenous business. Hair flowing like the best Pantene commercial when I was stopped in my tracks. A young girl, fair-skinned, bright-eyed, eager to talk, eager to ask, "Are you a real Indian?" I heard this question a million times from a million people, sometimes with eyes shining in romanticism, sometimes with eyes shining in skeptical colonialism, but a child's question is innocent, true reflective of her world, without malice, without years of wolf dancing, Cleveland Indianing, corporate sweat lodges, Lewis's named Daniel playing Indian all day. "Are you a real Indian?" "Yes, I am." To which her bright eyes got wide, her pigtails blowing in the wind of her flight, screaming in fear. She had not the years of the world we live in, but carried someone else's years upon her adolescent shoulders. Indigenous quandary, do I chase her and set her straight, thus perpetuating the fear that she has of my perceived savagery, or do I let her go, securing her fear of my perceived savagery? We're required to walk a fine line of savagery, or simply walk a fine line of savagery, because you're Indian if you do, and you're Indian if you don't.
Hello, my name is Keenan Holmes. I'm a public anthropology student right here in Washington, D.C. at American University. The purpose of this documentary is to understand what the indigenous population, local indigenous population of America are doing, specifically in the D.C., Maryland, and Virginia area, about the visual representation that they have no say in the discussion of how they're being portrayed. I interviewed 3 indigenous professionals working in and around the D.C. area, and I questioned them about how they feel about what's going on with cultural appropriation, commodification, and a lot of terms that I'll explain very shortly. In 2012, I began to really notice that clothing companies such as Gap had the terrible idea of selling t-shirts that said "Manifest Destiny," and that just is a reflection of the oppression that indigenous people went through in the 17 and 1800s. Later they apologized, but still there was no general understanding of why they shouldn't do that, and I'm surprised that idea ever left the boardroom. We had the Victoria's Secret fashion show in New York City, and one of the models was wearing a headdress and a bikini. Ralph Lauren made the same mistake by selling a rustic Wild West themed, Native Americans in like Henleys and sepia filters that people use on their cell phones to get an artsy old school feel. And they were selling merchandise very briefly because the whiplash came very fast. And it was commodification at work, it was appropriation at work, and it was a really cheap marketing ploy. As usual, they apologized, but these companies keep doing the same thing. It's a pattern that's not stopping. After the string of newsworthy incidents, I felt I wanted to ask indigenous people locally, how do you feel about this? Why are people doing this? How can we get them to stop? And what would you say to them if you had the opportunity?
We are people, that's your mascot!
As a public anthropology student, I wanted to use a certain type of theory to base my film on while interviewing the 3 participants in my questions. The critical race theory perspective I will be investigating from is based off the 2nd edition book that I love and have read 3 times cover to cover, called Critical Race Theory: An Introduction. Authors Richard Delgado and Gene Stefancic have graciously given their blessing for me to cite what I find to be such digestible ways to build community, talk about tough racial issues, and value people who need their voices amplified. Critical race theory, which I will be referring to as CRT for abbreviation. CRT studies what happens when a person may feel like a double minority if he or she is black and Latino, or gay and a woman. That is an example of intersectionality. In recent news, from fashion faux pas and inappropriate cultural clothing for sale, terms that anthropologists use, such as appropriation and commodification, have been appearing more and more frequently. Appropriation can very simply be explained as taking or borrowing someone else's culture without permission or proper context. It is viewed as a mockery of the original group's practices or cultural history. Commodification has many definitions or uses. In this documentary's context, it means clothing companies attempting to encapsulate indigenous identity into merchandise that separates who the people actually are and dehumanizes their existence into mere mascots and shirts for sale. Through American television and movies like Pocahontas, the American public has brought up their children to have the false idea of what it means to be Native American and how they're portrayed. Perceptions of being considered a legitimate Indian has already been problematic for the indigenous community, because if someone is not full-blooded, and if they have mixed heritage, which there's nothing wrong with that, you're still indigenous and you're still whatever the other half you are, you're not perceived as being Indian enough, and your opinion and value is not always honored and respected and valued in the way that it should be. Supporters of the Washington football team seem to keep clinging to the same tired argument that, oh, it's honor, we're honoring you. We're not using this as a slur, as a racial negative word. But how is that really honor? Using Washington, D.C., I will show you what real honor is. If anyone visits the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C., when you arrive, you see a very long stone architecture with the names of over 58,000 people that gave the ultimate sacrifice. They gave up their lives for that war. At that same memorial, you will see trees, plants, flowers that people lay down every day. There might be music playing, and you do feel honored. You do feel their memory respected of what they did during that war. That is honor. Now, tying this back to sports, in regards to baseball, hockey, football, how is men running in tights and uniforms chasing a puck with hockey sticks, a football or a soccer ball or a baseball, how is that honoring to Native Americans across the country? With the Washington football team mascot of the caricature of a fictional Native American with skin red and the oversized nose, because that clings to what an indigenous person looks like, it doesn't even look like anyone. There are over 550 indigenous nations or tribes, which term you want to use. There's over 550 nations in this country. And who is the mascot supposed to be honoring? Now on to the issue of the term politically correct. Since 2010, it's really been a big issue of people not being wimpy or being overly sensitive, but what's wrong with respecting everyone's idea on how to be better people? What's wrong with having edifying language? Why are you considered a weaker person because of that? For example, African Americans or black people, whichever term you want to use, they decided 60, 50, 80 years ago that they no longer want to be referred to as Negroes. Rarely, if at all, and if you do, it's someone who shouldn't be using that term, no one uses the term Negroes anymore. They call them African American or black. Why? Because the African American population said, hey, this is how we want to be referred to now. Do not call us Negroes anymore. Fast forwarding to the mid-2000s, the gay community said, hey, stop using the term that's gay, when really someone just means that's weird, that's goofy, that's dumb, that's annoying. It's not synonymous. And because the gay community and those who support them said, stop using that word, people did. Some people still use it, but generally it's definitely died down. Why? Because people asked to be respected, and then we did that for them. But the indigenous community, it's a whole different ballgame for some reason. When they say, hey, we don't want to be called Redskins anymore, we don't like that term, stop using it for your sport that has nothing to do with our cultural identity and cultural markers of visual representation, people say, oh, well, in the 1940s, and some indigenous people were cool with the name. Well, let's stop right there for a second. That's also the same tired argument that's always being used. In the 1940s, it's only been 20 years since indigenous people were able to vote. So people may say they had bigger fish to fry, or they were happy to finally be included in American dialogue, but they weren't barking up that tree of that issue at that time. Maybe some were against it, but they didn't speak out. With the indigenous population, they're not allowed to say we don't want the name anymore, and they're considered as politically correct. If they just want the name changed, why can't we oblige them and say, hey, you don't like being called this, so we'll do you that favor? Washington football team owner Dan Snyder has made it crystal clear that he's not going to change the name of the Washington football team out of just social justice issues and a respect for the indigenous fellow citizens of our country. If he does it, it'll be because of a term that we use in critical race theory called cultural convergence. What that means is he's not going to change the name because he wants to, or he feels like it's the right thing. If he does change the name and advocate for another people group, not of his own, it'll be because of a money issue or a way that both people groups win. What that would entail is FedEx, which has the namesake over the Washington football team field that they play at, FedEx would have to drop them and say, hey, we're not going to support you while you have this racist slur of a football team name. FedEx would have to drop them. Or, for example, pressure from the NFL says that Dan Snyder will lose his tax break. Then he might have the incentive to change the name. It wouldn't be out of the goodness of his heart. The three professionals that I interviewed for this documentary do very distinct and very unique things for living, very unique hobbies, occupations, but there's a general thread of advocacy for their indigenous population.
My name is Carrie Hawk-Lassard, and I am Shawnee.
Where do you work, and what exactly do you do?
I am the executive director of an Indian Health Service contract site in Baltimore, Maryland. It's called Native American Lifelines, and we provide care to urban American Indians, Alaska Natives.
How did you get into anthropology, and how have you seen it shape your work?
I got into anthropology because I was trying to find a way to work with Native people. I came to the field when I was very young, in my 20s, and a lot of people that age, you have a lot of passion, but maybe not a lot of knowledge or maturity in how to go about making a difference in your community. So I was very angry, the more I grew and the more I knew of the history of the relationship between the government and Native people. So anthropology seemed a good fit for that. I actually became an anthropologist because I read Dolores Custer Died for Your Sins, and it is very critical of the way that anthropology has built itself as a discipline on the backs of Native people. So because of those admonitions, I decided to enter the field of anthropology because I was interested in deconstructing it, rather not destructing it. But that could be as well.
What are some topics that you've written about or advocated for that involves the indigenous population?
My writing really is exclusively about indigenous people. These days I'm concerned with the issue of historical trauma and the way that it impacts the contemporary health status of Native people. I focus on the types of things in urban communities because that can be a little different. We're sort of in the middle of all of these other populations. What are our specific traumatic issues that maybe color our mental health and lead us into what I call as an anthropologist the health demoting behavioral practices. So what are the things that we do as Native people that aren't good for us, or what are the things that we're constrained into doing that limit health that can be traced back to historical trauma? So I tend to write a lot about imagery and the way that Native people don't own our image, our likeness, our cultures, and that non-Native and usually white culture has more authority to speak to those things than I do. And so as a mixed race person, as an urban Indian person, that I am evaluated, juxtaposed with an image that really hasn't been created by any Native person, but Hollywood or pop culture or whatnot, and that is the authentic Indian, and I, as a real, person, am not. And what does that mean for my behavioral health? What does that mean for the mental health of the kids that are living, in this environment and have to negotiate within it?
Could you define for the audience what exactly is historical trauma?
So historical trauma, and I'll try to paraphrase, there's a Lakota scholar, Maria Yellow Horse Braveheart. I think most of us working in the field do look to her definitions, but she talks about the cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over lifespans that impact on the well-being of people. So when I talk about it, when I paraphrase what historical trauma is, I'm thinking of loss of land, loss of language, loss of agency, the mass genocide of Native people that happened within a relatively recent time frame. So, we may have people in our communities who have great grandparents who were, at the massacre at Wounded Knee, or, something that happened that has been passed down, and it's in a relatively short span of time, that we still carry those burdens, and those burdens are amplified by the daily microaggressions that we face as a marginalized or kind of subaltern group of people within the superstructure of American culture. And in the boarding schools, when our kids were taken away from their families, they were also in these religious institutions where sexual violence against children took place. And that, that was really, really difficult because our kids didn't learn how to parent. They didn't learn how to have healthy sexual relationships. I'm thinking, so this May, my grandpa will have crossed over 4 years. It'll be 4 years, and he had Alzheimer's. He was in a hospital. He had eloped, and it was like the beginning of the end for him. He was in the hospital room, and I'd go and I'd stay with him every day, and I'd sing to him. And he was in the hospital. He didn't know what his name was half the time. He didn't know who I was half the time. But this priest came in to the room, and my grandpa went like right back to being little and being violated in the Catholic school system, and he was so frightened. So this was the man that always took care of me, afraid because this priest showed up, and that reminded him of those abuses, and tried to defend this man who was my protector. But then the worst thing is, like, he was 86 when he died. He carried that from a little boy. So people don't, everybody thinks, oh, the church is good, the church is benign. I don't feel that way. I don't feel that way about it at all. Not the structure. It's really done a lot of damage to our people. That's the historical trauma, and that's really, really real. And that made such an impression on me, and made an impression on me and how I do my work in community, that it just, allowing us to have our cultures, like, is that so hard? Must we all be Christian? Are we bad if we don't take your book? But it's hard when you see somebody you love go through that, and it didn't have to be that way, but they made it that way. So
one of the books I'm referencing for my research is Critical Race Theory, an introduction, and one of the issues they talk about with Indigenous resistance is the topic of unconscious racism, and as you mentioned earlier, microaggression. Mm-hmm. Could you explain what microaggression is and where is it prevalent? Okay,
so microaggression, they're the kind of unintentional or perhaps subconscious things that people say that invalidate your identity, your experience, or might otherwise be seen as hostile. Microaggression for me often, comes in the form of, well, you don't look Indian. How much Indian are you? If you're Indian, why do you have blue eyes? Because obviously no Native person could have blue eyes. That actually happened to me. I have relatives who live on the Rosebud at Pine Ridge Indian reservations, and I was visiting Badlands, and my husband's always a lot freer with information, like why we're there, what we're doing. I don't tell anybody anything because it's none of their business. But he was talking about being in ceremony, and the park ranger asked me why I had blue eyes. Like, how could I have relatives here and have blue eyes? And so then that goes into the lateral oppression, right, that we see within our communities. But microaggression plays itself out that way, and kind of tacks back to the issue I talked about before, and why historical trauma is an area of concern, because someone saying something like that to me means that they feel that they have the right and the privilege to comment on the way I'm identifying myself and the way I'm experiencing my life, and that they have, the right to adjudicate that whether what I'm saying is legitimate or not. And oftentimes I find people bring those things up when I've made an argument that they don't agree with. It was, God forbid, Native people. I was just talking with Greg about how Native people aren't allowed to be intelligent or educated, that people don't think that we can compete on that level. So if I make an argument, let's say about the mascot issue, and somebody doesn't agree with my position, or they don't like what I have to say, they won't argue with me about the merits of my position, but they will say, well, you're not really Indian anyway, or, how much Indian are you? So they invalidate what I am telling them about myself, whereas I don't think it's the common experience of other people to be asked how much white they are, how much black they are, how much any of those other things. That's why I really don't like the use of the word offensive in discourse about Native issues, because I think when you say something is offensive, you're speaking from a place of emotion and not a fact-based place. If I use my education and say, well, no, a study of syndemics really shows you the correlation between historical trauma and substance abuse, or, indiscriminate sexual behavior in Native people that contributes to their contraction of HIV, hepatitis C, STIs, or the depreciated mental health status of people, and their eyes glaze over. They don't want to hear me talk reason to them. It's just easier to poke a hole in my theory if I say, well, I don't like that mascot, it's offensive, it hurts my feelings. I think that is such a weak argument, and I think it really sanitizes what those things do to Native people. They are a celebration of our genocide. They are a celebration of the destruction of our beautiful culture. So, no, I'm not offended by that. You're celebrating, the destruction of things that were important to my people. You're standing on my homelands, disrespecting me. So that is more than just offensive. That's violent, in my opinion.
One quote I also found relatable to what you've just said is, the problem with our country claiming to be colorblind is that if Americans aren't racist, then they don't have to apologize for past mistakes or rectifying lingering issues, or even address the conversations of racial tension. With that in mind, you mentioned privilege earlier. Can you explain what white privilege is and why that's why it appears as such a accusatory term that no one wants to take ownership for?
Yeah, I think white people aren't used to being in a position where, and I'm sure people will disagree with me, where their actions are challenged. That there was a recent incident where Michelle Obama said, black girls rock, and people shit their pants, like, oh my God, all girls rock. And society tells white girls they rock 24/7, 365. White girls are going to be fine. Black girls never get told that they rock. Indian girls never, brown people never rarely ever have their experience validated or celebrated. So I think that that's just a completely disingenuous argument that, society backs you up. Your privilege is not in question, but I think people are so, it's such an invisible structure to them. For reasons still unknown to me, people will go to communities where people live and just invade their space and gawk like, I would never, my big dream is to win the lottery and get a tour bus and fill it with just people from all these different reservations, and then go to these gated communities and tour around to see how those people live, because that's what they do to us. So the white privilege think, that if you have any fictional or fractional Native heritage, whether you may be part of a community or not, usually not, that justifies whatever kind of jacked up behavior that you want to engage in. White people would not put up with that shit. You throw a ball into Miss Jones' motherfucking lawn, and she's having a cow because her prize-winning orchids, your ball just came in there, and she's got no problem jacking you up. But people will go into Native communities and feel that they have every right to be there. Our cultures are really modest. Like at ceremony, you can't have your arms uncovered. Your aunties and grandmas will yell at you if you don't have a slip-on under your dress because the sun comes through and they can see your legs. We have modest cultures. It wasn't always the case, but now it is. But to hypersexualize our women and know that they are fetishized and seen as subhuman, and that sexual violence is such an important tool within conquest and colonialism. When we were working on Redskin, when we were getting the space ready, Greg was outside painting, and I think you guys were outside, and I was inside trying to get the space ready. Like, I don't like to be idle. I like to do. So I was just finding something to do, and I was inside sweeping. And this friend of Greg's, white guy, walks into the space, like he's looking around. I think Greg had maybe started some murals inside. But he walks through the place. He says hello to you, says hello to Greg, just does not say one word to me, just, ignores my existence as he's walking through the space until he's just about to exit. And what he says to me is like, you're going to have to sweep a little harder to get all of this cleaned up. And I thought, well, fuck you. I've got a master's degree. I am asked to speak to people about historical trauma, and I was just so infuriated by that. I couldn't even speak. I just left. I just had to leave. But, I think it's more like that white dude and his privilege just assuming that because of what I'm doing, that says something about my status. And that was really fucking insulting. So I've never had any difficulty privileging my indigeneity over my femininity. I mean, to me, they're the same thing. But in my interactions with people that don't respect either, that's a problem.
So in the media recently, there's been a lot of high schoolers that have taken charge and worked hard to eliminate their former, let's say they had a redskin or any type of stereotypical Native American imagery as a mascot. And I think it's fascinating that kids have spearheaded this change. And I find it fascinating also that Dan Snyder is being so resilient and not changing, and is there anything you want to say about how you've seen things kind of evolving on the issue of the mascot?
Well, first of all, I think it's interesting that Dan Snyder was poised to sue the Washington City paper when he thought an illustration was anti-Semitic. So his pain has a dollar value. His pain means something. But he's very easy to dismiss the pain of Native people, and I find that very interesting. I was part of a Q&A session with Greg Deal, where someone was asking questions, and this guy just kind of sat back, and his body language, he's just talking about, well, if you continue to see yourself as a victim, why don't you just go out there and get a job and leave the reservation? It was some kind of rhetoric like that, and I thought, like, no one would say, so, the guy that handed me my diploma when I graduated from undergrad was Elie Wiesel. No one would say to a Holocaust survivor, get over it. Nobody would say that. But they say it to us like it's nothing. So because I would just think that Dan Snyder would be a little more sensitive to that. For that matter, I'm surprised that we don't have the African American allies that we have, because, if the team were called the niggers, nobody would be cool with that. So I was telling you the story of the Halloween thing, when my HR person couldn't get it, and she was saying that Pocahontas was fine. I said, cool, then I'm going to come in blackface dressed as Aunt Jemima. Is everybody going to be okay with that? And oddly enough, no one would have been okay with that. So there's this, not to play the oppression Olympics, but there's a hierarchy there. And I think because the African American community also has been better about asserting its rights. Carter Camp was a leader in the American Indian movement, and one of my relatives through my extended family. But he would joke, well, nobody's afraid of us burning their shit down. When we start to do that, then maybe people will pay attention. I think kids, maybe not in the white affluent suburbs, but they are used to more diversity in their lives, and they borrow liberally from things, for good or for bad. So, I'm not surprised necessarily that kids are ahead of the curve from other folks. You can't take from native cultures and then separate the cultures from the people. You've got to care about both, and so the issues that people will talk about, and I've even heard native activists talk about it, that there are bigger issues. It bothers me when non-native people say that, because again, your privilege is telling me what should be my priority, but that we have bigger issues, and I don't see it that way. And again, it's my conceptualization of historical trauma that in a short period of time we went to living in our own lands, to being put on reservations, to being taken away from our families, to boarding school where we weren't allowed to have our names, we weren't allowed to have our ceremonies, we weren't allowed to have our languages. My family didn't stop speaking Shawnee because they were tired of it and they just wanted to speak English. It's lost. I have one or two words. Thank goodness for my Lakota relatives, that I share some of their language so I can have indigenous words and concepts come from my mouth and my head. But it wasn't because we didn't want that stuff. That was legislated away from us. That was beaten out of us. And then, just the dysfunction that followed in our communities from that, the intergenerational poverty, the helplessness, the substance abuse, the sexual abuse, the dysfunction that just came. We have to deal with that. Like, that is our work. But to say that that's not connected to the mascot issue, I think it very much is, because that is the microaggression that takes us right back to the historical trauma impact. Because you telling me that what is on this helmet shouldn't matter to me, it is invalidating. It's saying that you have the power to make decisions about my life. So it's absolutely associated to that historical trauma that then depreciates the self-concept of Native people, that depreciates the self-efficacy of Native people. Something Greg says, which I always think about, is if we can't trust people to take us seriously about something that they think is so minor, like mascots, how are we going to expect that they're going to honor treaties, acknowledge, the environmental justice concerns of Native people? If we can't trust you on these small issues, how am I going to trust you to make decisions that aren't going to steal our children from our families? So, it's all related, because these all are things that are connected to our, oppressed, and I don't like using that word, but our lack of privilege and power, our lack of voice, our lack of agency and authority, and they're absolutely related. So to say that there are bigger issues is just absolutely disingenuous from where I sit.
My name is Greg Deal. I'm a member of the Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe, and I'm also a Shoshone and Washoe. I am a full-time artist, which embodies performance art, fine art, painting, graphic design, printmaking, installation work, conceptual work, the whole 9 yards. So The Last American Indian on Earth is essentially a performance art piece. It's about stereotype. And as an Indigenous person, as an Indigenous artist, wielding the stereotype from my perspective and documenting the way that it's treated, consumed, regurgitated, and ultimately used in the public spectrum. And where a stereotype exists, constantly and always, and has a very specific definition to it, to be able to not just document that, but to also almost redefine how it is, because it's coming from my perspective as opposed to just being out in public. And it was really about a social project, a performance art piece. It was about taking these things that we're familiar with and looking at them from a different perspective. So last year, for Art All Night, I participated in an installation that included a performance piece called Redskin. And Redskin was about being the Indian in the room and dealing with microaggression as it pertains to the Washington football team. I was in the middle of the room, and I had 4 antagonizers that were there to bring to the table all of the type of vernacular that's within the realm of this conversation, particularly in publications where they're talking about the Washington football team and then looking at the comment sections and things that people say and the arguments that they make in favor of mascots, which are essentially microaggressions, and compounding those things into one place onto one person. So they're no longer micro, they're pretty much out there, but it puts into perspective the way that people will talk to Indigenous people when it comes to things about stereotypes and mascots. And so Redskin was about showcasing that and showing that and kind of suffering for that. For what was supposed to be for 8 hours, it ended up being for 4 hours. But I think was a success. Social media, social media is kind of a necessary tool nowadays. I don't know that it would have been my first choice, except that it's become like a necessary tool for everything. In the same way that a business has a business card, you have to have something that represents these things. But in the world of art, and particularly within performance art, it becomes a pretty key piece of equipment to document what's happening, document what's being said, document interactions and the things that I'm doing, and that interaction is essentially like an investment of my work and of my time. As far as advocacy and as far as activism, it plays a role. I don't think it's the end all to be all to those things, but it definitely plays a role in helping to get more information out there. So the mascot issue gains ground because there's a lot more voices that wouldn't otherwise be heard. So it ends up being another tool or another platform to get information out there. I think more people come into contact with things than they realize, but when it comes to actual individuality and individuality that sets them apart to the extreme that we're talking about, people can't handle that, and they don't know how to handle it. I mean, the last American Indian on Earth is a really good example of that, taking something like this image into public in the way that people interact and react to it. People are limited in their ability to process these things in an appropriate way. Appropriating things for your own personal gain or your own personal input or thought, which undermines the real purpose of those things to begin with. The Indigenous stereotype exists because of those things. Western culture perpetuates that through consumption. Indigenous mascots are inappropriate alone because they represent what we aren't. They represent what people want us to be. I look at American culture, which is the thing that really has consumed and regurgitated Indigenous identity, certainly through mascots, as being like a stalker that we can't get a restraining order against. Because they have this ideal that this is what we're supposed to be, and this is how we're supposed to carry ourselves, and we're supposed to be majestic and strong and powerful and standing in the face of adversity, and really just a bunch of romantic crap. And when we don't rise to that, then they get mad and they abuse us. It's like a really bad relationship. And in terms of, the actual semantics, I mean, the Washington Redskins would be most offensive because the term redskin is a dictionary-defined slur. It's a word that has roots that go back really far, but ultimately land on the bounties that were placed on Indigenous heads through manifest destiny, Indians who were in the way of progression, to wipe them out to make way for progression, for land grabs. That you have non-natives that are saying this is what Indians are, and I think at its core, is that appropriate? And the answer to that is a very obvious and emphatic no. No other minority group would allow themselves to be defined by somebody that is not of that group, particularly a group that has a history of oppression and a history of actual physical termination as policy in dealing with their relations with Indigenous people. But for some reason, people don't understand that. They can't understand that. And it's because of this ownership. It's because of this stalker mentality of you're mine and I'm going to make you do what I want you to do. And you're going to do it whether you like it or not. You're going to be my Indian. That was a comment. I saw that as a comment towards Amanda Blackhorse. You're my Indian. You will always be my Indian. And there's nothing you can do about it. So I look at mascots and stereotypes. It's like having a stalker you can't get a restraining order against.
Racism is difficult to address or cure because it's not acknowledged. How would you agree or disagree with that statement or sentiment?
Racism only exists because of the culture that we live in, and the culture that we live in is built on racial superiority. And while there is an issue obviously with white people, black people, Latino people, all the way down the line. But this country is built upon racial superiority from Europeans, white people, and that superiority has carried over into things like social class and political class, as well as racial classes. So the complexities of those things become so much so that when I'm standing in a place having a discussion about stereotype, that a person of color could be telling me that I'm wrong and that I'm full of it just as much as a white person could be. So I think it's really complex because we're looking at assimilation, and assimilation tends to come with a pretty heavy bout of amnesia, and people forget where they come from and where their origins are from and how to navigate those things in a proper way. The culture that we live in is about racial superiority. This country's built upon racial superiority. And if it's not built on racial superiority, it's built on class superiority, because there is a class issue that's in place as well. Once I was playing a game with somebody. It was my wife and I. We were playing a game with this couple, and it was called Scruples. And Scruples is asking questions that are you would maybe deem as inappropriate. You're trying to get an answer out of somebody. So my wife gets this question, and she decides that she's going to just throw it out there. And she asks this other guy, and the couple that's with us, they're white. And she says, your daughter wants to marry a black man. Do you stop him? And his answer to that was, yes, I would stop him. Or I would stop my daughter from marrying a black man, because they would have half-breed babies, and half-breed babies don't have any place in society. Which at the time I found to be very upsetting. But at the same time, there's a little bit of truth to that, in that I'm not brown enough to be Native, and I'm not white enough to be white. And I can carry myself as being Indigenous if my hair looks a certain way, or if it's summertime and I've got a good tan. But I can also, like, especially on the East Coast, I can blend in as being white, or I can be at least, non-black, I guess. And the difficulty of that is navigating where you stand and where you are. And I think it ultimately has to be your own decision. It is my own decision. When I was a kid, I was made fun of for being Native. When I got older and I claimed being Native because that was the identity that was thrust upon me, I was having people giving me a hard time because I wasn't Native enough. The race argument ends up being completely invalidated by the fact that the media only concentrates on black and white, and that they don't really mess around with any of the shades in between. But it depends on where you go. I mean, if you look at the statistics for Black Lives Matter, Native Americans have a higher percentage of being killed per capita than any person who is black in the black community. At the same time, these deaths were happening in Ferguson and in New York and in Baltimore, and police brutality is on the rise. There was a Southern Paiute kid that was shot and killed by a police officer walking on the street in southern Utah. There was a Native Lives Matter out in North Dakota in Rapid City where a young man was at the rally and the next day he was killed by a police officer. These things are happening, and they're not being given the ground that they need in order to have a conversation about race in America beyond being black or white, because the media doesn't think that they have the bandwidth to deal with it. But I also think that it plays a role in separating races and in making sure that those races don't have the solidarity and support for each other that they have to have. Because what ends up happening, like what happened in Baltimore, is it's a black issue. The black community comes out, they're marching, and they are protesting, in some cases are rioting, and are showing aggression towards the police officers in some of these neighborhoods. And they're calling upon the Native community to join them, and that if they don't, that they're not being fair or showing proper solidarity. Meanwhile, before all of this happened, the black community has nothing to do with the Native community and doesn't support them. And so it plays a role in separating all these races, thus dividing and conquering people of color in America and never really being able to enact change. I'll tell you a story. I'll relate this in a story. I was working in Shaw on murals last year for Art All Night, and a guy was there, black gentleman, been there for generations, and he said, "What's wrong with the football team? It's not offensive." And I said to him, "Who told you it wasn't offensive?" He's like, "Well, the team. Who runs the team?" He's like, "Well," I'm like, "So you're telling me that a white guy told you that it wasn't offensive?" He's like, "Yeah, but," I'm like, "Listen, let's look at the logic here. You have generations here in this city, which means that you probably had family that walked with Dr. King. You probably went to the Million Man March." And he's like, yeah. And I'm like, "And you're telling me after all that, the history of your family, the fight for civil rights, the amount of work that goes into that you're just going to blindly believe a rich white guy who has a vested interest in keeping this name in place so that he can continue to stay in the top 1%, that it's not offensive just because he said so?" The history of, and I mean, I'm well versed in the history of civil rights and for the black communities, because the concepts and the philosophies that come through that also go into other races in America, because it's not necessarily about black civil rights in America, it's about racial equal rights in America. And so all of the concepts and philosophies matter in that sense. And so it boggles my mind when you have a people that have fought for civil rights and for equal rights and for justice and are still fighting for those things, and that they blindly let this thing go. They would fight against blackface for obvious reasons, but indigeneity and stereotypes within indigeneity is not as obvious. And to me, there's nothing sadder and nothing more hypocritical than seeing a Black Lives Matter rally with people wearing Washington Redskins baseball caps in the crowd. Because it completely takes away from the concept of value of human life, value of racial life in the context of American society. When I'm listening to Suzanne Harjo talking about how while they're fighting mascots in the 60s and in the 70s, that they are also standing with the Latinos to fight Frito Bandito, and they're also standing with the black community to fight Black Sambo restaurants. They're not questioning whether or not there are bigger things that matter more. They're simply standing with them because those things are important to these people, and it's important for us to show solidarity by standing with them. We are not offered the same courtesy as an indigenous people. And it's because of the way that America consumes us and has phrased us and has essentially told our story for us, which is we don't matter, and that we're all out there playing powwow and wearing feathers in our hair and not existing anymore. We emulate what we see. Indigenous children are in danger with appropriation and with these identity issues because we are what we see. So if somebody comes along and tells you that Pocahontas is the quintessential end-all to be-all indigenous woman as phrased by Walt Disney, what does that say for the girl who's half and has fair skin and has lighter hair, but still a member of her tribe and still a member of her community, and doesn't have the long sexualized legs and the long black flowing hair and the beautiful brownish skin, and is able to talk to animals and her grandmother in a tree. I mean, that completely takes away from the actual stories and the actual community-minded interaction that our children have, the meaningful discourse that they have with their parents and with their grandparents and with their great-grandparents and with their aunties and with their uncles. And that identity is being stripped away. And it's not just stripped away, it's also used as a comparative measure. Well, the Washington football team, the side of the helmet, the disembodied head, that's what an Indian looks like. That's not what I look like. And it takes away from the diversity of Indian country. It takes away from the 566 different tribes in Indian country, the over 300 different languages, all the different traditions and creation stories that go into that. And frankly, the diversity of looks and feels and languages and the way that we carry ourselves and the jokes that we make. It takes away from all of that. It pigeonholes Indigenous identity into being one thing that is completely unrealistic and completely unattainable. And that ultimately hurts the mental health and well-being of our children. I'm concerned about that for my kids because they're just slightly fair-skinned than I am, and they're going to have to contend with this idea of identity, and they shouldn't have to. And the only reason why they have to contend with it is because America says it's okay to appropriate these things and to carry these things, because they are not giving any frame of reference between the 1900s and today with an understanding of where these things are, where they lie, why they're inappropriate, and the things that have happened to Indigenous people over the years. Well, the producers of The Daily Show were looking at different prominent voices within the mascot debate. One way or another, they came across my name, gave me a call, we had a conversation. They liked what I said, they liked the way I carried myself. Of course, I was on Kamau Bell, totally biased with FX, so that kind of helped it as well. But it ended up being like the who's who of people who are in Indian country. I mean, I know the 1491s. I know Amanda Blackhorse. I know Tara Hauska. I know I know a couple of the other people there. Simon Moya Smith, the writer. So we were all kind of peers, and so it worked out that way. It's in that moment where there's a movement happening because there's people that all know each other from the same circles doing the same things. And I felt like it was more of that than anything else.
Can't drink oil, no water, no light. Can't drink oil, no water, no light. Can't drink oil, no water, no light. Can't drink oil, no water, no light.
My name is Tara Hauska, and I'm a citizen of Couchiching First Nation.
What is your occupation and where do you work?
I'm a tribal rights attorney for a law firm that exclusively practices Native American law in Washington, D.C.
How have you seen Indigenous resistance in the realm of the law?
I mean, a lot of what we do is asserting tribal sovereignty and working within the constructs that already exist to basically make our own sovereignty stronger.
And what groups of people do you work with or advocate for?
So we work with tribes all across the United States, and a lot of what we do is lobbying here in D.C. So we go up on the Hill and go to the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs and try to push whatever our clients are looking for, whether it be funding for a hospital, funding for a school, trying to pass through stronger water settlements rights. Like I actually just worked on water settlements almost all day yesterday. So it's just kind of everything and anything you can imagine.
Chapter 2 of Critical Race Theory, the book I'm referencing, deals with the idea of structural determinism, which is the idea that our system, by reason of its structured vocabulary, is ill-equipped to redress certain types of wrong. How would you view that assessment in viewing the strength of lobbying?
I think lobbying at the same time, although we're working against other lobbyists that are very powerful, like, big tobacco, big oil, they obviously can command a lot of authority on the Hill. At the same time, I think that a lot of the senators and a lot of the congresspersons kind of recognize that tribes do have a very significant say, particularly in states like Arizona where there's a large tribal population. John McCain knows that election really matters, and it matters that, tribes are they're the ones that hold all the water, right? And for instance, in Arizona, that they're the ones that hold the most significant amount of water in Arizona. So they know that they have to kind of work with the tribes and recognize them as a government-to-government relationship.
Critical race theory, the book expounds on the black-white binary in America. So, with the current issues of police, actions and just, it's very politically charged, black versus white, and that leads to a lot of groups, and, the police complex issues, segregation, welfare stereotypes, it's very polarized. What does the binary system, as it is, do? How does it make your work, more difficult, since there's a lot of people left out?
Sure, I would actually use Black Lives Matter as an example for something like that. So Native Americans are actually more likely to be killed by the police than any other race. Yet that whole discussion has been just about the black and white binary, and there's been no discussion whatsoever about Native Americans and their experience with the police, which, as being less than 2% of the population, but yet being the most likely to be killed by police officers, that should be being talked about, but it's not at all. And when the hashtag Native Lives Matter started up, a lot of activists actually were very upset with that, and they were like, you're kind of taking away from our storyline, but at the same time, we're like, yes, but this storyline is occurring and it's not being addressed at all.
The internet has been helpful in, getting the word out, and what form, like what social medias are you most familiar with, or how have you used it for your work?
Yeah, Twitter. I mean, Twitter is probably one of the most powerful tools that I think for activism and social media activism. You can create an entire dialogue just on, using one hashtag and see what hundreds of people are saying across the United States about it. And if you want to learn about a subject, you just click on it and you can see a whole dialogue happening. I would say, though, at the same time, for organizing purposes, Facebook is very helpful. So, if I want to go throw down at FedEx Field, I just create a Facebook event and let everyone know this is going to happen.
Lauren Ingram of Fox News spoke of the teenagers at Lancaster Redskins, their mascot at New York High School. They were saying that the students were just trying to have their Selma moment. And what is your take on her essentializing, what Indigenous are going through as, it's just another black movement, or it's a smaller version of such?
Yeah, and I think one of the discussions I had with an African American who attended actually the demonstration that we did at FedEx Field against the mascot, he wanted to just march and show solidarity, and had no idea that the level of animosity and hatred that we experienced from the angry fans. I mean, he was shocked. He was actually shocked and could not believe that that was happening. And he was like, I feel like I was in 1960 walking down the streets for in the civil rights movement. I mean, that's exactly how it felt. And I'm telling him, it is a civil rights movement. I mean, we're trying to assert back our identity. It was taken without permission. And I don't think you could find a Native American that would be like, oh yeah, go ahead, call me Redskin. I mean, of course not. Like, that would be completely unacceptable. And so I think it's moving towards people realizing that it's not just a political correctness that is actually important to us, but I think there's still a lot of education to be done.
Why is wearing Indigenous-oriented clothing accessories inappropriate out of context?
So the headdresses, basically. You see these headdresses on, the faux headdresses on people, and they're, models, feral, whatever, right? And they say, oh, they're just beautiful things, and I want to wear a beautiful thing. Well, a headdress, if you actually understand what it means, it's on the same level as a Medal of Honor. And you don't see people wearing faux medals of honor. I mean, that would be completely unacceptable and completely offensive to the veterans that have actually earned them, which is the same thing as a headdress. Each of those feathers was earned for an act of bravery or honor or whatever it is. And so to commodify that and make it into something cheap that you can just buy and look pretty to, Coachella is completely unacceptable.
What are the boundaries of someone who wants to purchase Indigenous-themed clothing?
Yeah, I think that can be perfectly acceptable. I mean, if you go out to a reservation and you visit and you see all the artistry, and when you want to buy something, I mean, that's what it's there for. The artisans are creating it to share their work with everyone else, right? That's a very big difference between going to Urban Outfitters and buying the Navajo panty, right? I mean, that's not the same thing at all. That's something that's been appropriated and made into like this cheap mockery of actual Navajo patterns, which, I mean, most patterns are passed down through families, through generations. There's something that's significant. You can actually recognize which family is tied to which pattern, right? Or I mean, in my culture, beadwork is very, very important, and it's a certain style of beadwork that is associated with Ojibwe people. And so to see that cheaply made, it's very upsetting, and it's something that if you are a person that's interested in buying Native American themed things, go to the Native Americans and buy it from them.
So a lot of Navajo work is used in pop culture, hipster clothing, articles of clothing. How come they're allowed to call it Navajo? Like, does the Arts and Crafts Act of 1990 is there any protection, or is it just an uphill battle? That's the problem.
There actually are I mean, the Navajo Nation actually trademarked its name, and so they've sued Urban Outfitters for the Navajo hipster panty. I mean, they have sued them, and they have protections under the Indian Arts and Crafts Act, and they have protections under trademark law because they're saying that's not from us. So don't act like it is. You can't claim to be of Navajo when you're not.
So when Indigenous people speak out against how they feel in this issue and how they don't want it being done the way it's been dealt for the last 100, 200 years, why are Native Americans portrayed as being too politically correct or touchy? Like, why is it throwing it back on you? Like, you're the one in the wrong.
I think it's really hard for people, to kind of hear these things and be educated about those issues, because once they find out, then they're like, oh no, I'm doing that. I didn't realize I was doing that. I don't want to do that. So it's really just you're being overly sensitive. And I mean, particularly, with the mascot issue, for instance, we're telling them, here are all these empirical studies saying that these mascots actually harm Native American children, who are the most at risk for suicide, ages 15 to 24 in the United States. I mean, they're 2.5 times more likely than any race to commit suicide. That's terrible. And so knowing that a mascot, something as stupid as a mascot, is harming that child, I mean, that should be enough right there. But most people don't want to hear that. They don't want to know that. They don't want to be associated with it. So instead they're going to say, oh, it's just political correctness, and you're just having your feelings hurt, and we're honoring you. And I'm like, I don't think you get to decide what honors me.
Can you speak to the sports fans of the Washington football team, the ones that feel proud and legitimate in their use of regalia and sport, mascot wearing events, and drunk on the field wearing things? And what would you want to speak to them, and why they feel they have ownership over the imagery?
Yeah, so I mean, you talk to them and they say, I love the team, and this is a tradition, and it's like, our family's been fans for years and years and years, and I'm honoring you, and it's not meant to be offensive. I mean, it is offensive, and you can't change the fact that it's offensive. I mean, it's actually a dictionary defines slur, let alone what I just said, which is, it harms Native American children. And I mean, there was just another recent study actually that came out where they primarily surveyed white children and showed them all these Native mascots to kind of see like what the relationship was between the two. The relationship was that they automatically associated Native Americans with those stereotypes, and were more likely to associate other stereotypes with other ethnicities because they had seen that and because they were seeing these caricatures. And I mean, that's incredibly harmful and not something we should be teaching our children. I mean, the saddest thing to me is seeing a little kid wearing Washington football team gear, because I'm looking at them and saying, okay, well, you obviously are learning about Native Americans, and this is how you're learning about them.
Critical race theory speaks heavily on the issue of intersectionality, which delves into the combinations of people that we all are. Some citizens in this country are black and gay, some face barriers as a Latino woman, or struggles as a Caucasian man below the poverty line who needs welfare. And there's this dichotomy, if you will. As an Indigenous woman, what have been some of your experiences in law school, and how, being the double whammy of two separate things, like how have you seen that played out in the workforce?
So particularly in law school, what comes to mind is I actually did patent law and did not intend to do Native American law because my background is hard science. And so I was going to go do patent law and work for 3M and all that stuff, right? Which obviously did not happen, but I had to take all of those patent law courses, which are only for hard science people. And so generally, I was in a class of, 8 other males, always 8 white males, almost 99% of the time. And so I got a lot of, oh, you're Native American? Oh, so did you get a really big scholarship? I mean, that's why you got in, right? I heard that all of the time. And, it felt especially good when the grades would post and my grade was better than all of theirs. I mean, that felt awesome. But at the same time, it was very, very felt that they thought the reason that I was there was because I was Native American and because I was a woman. So I do a lot of activism, with that particular issue online in protests and all that kind of stuff. And so a producer contacted me and, asked me if I could do it. And I went and talked to my firm, who just the day before had said I could be publicly against the issue. And so I got to say the first thing that I wanted to do publicly was go on the Daily Show. And they were, oh my goodness, Tara, really? Like, this is how you're starting out? And I was like, I don't know. I mean, it's a huge thing. I think it was, for Native Americans, I thought that was a really, really important moment because you don't see 8 young Native American professionals on television ever. You see people that, bronze their faces and play like, a stereotyped Native American from like the 1950s, kind of like Westerns, but you don't see Native Americans that are actually living, breathing people here today wearing normal clothing.
So there's a lot of discussion on what to call you. So some people say Native American, some people say Indigenous, some people say American Indian. What do you prefer, and how do you do your way of rebelling against colonialism, or what terms do you go by? What do you find acceptable, as it varies?
Yeah, I think it's all over the place. Like I practice, it's called federal Indian law, and most of the statutes are the Indian Child Welfare Act or, they're Indian Water Rights Settlements Acts. I don't have a problem with that term. Personally, I prefer to be called Native. Just because Native Americans were not made Americans until 1924 when we were unilaterally made Native Americans. So we became American citizens because the federal government decided that we were going to become American citizens. So I don't like that term. I like being called Native. Or Anishinaabe, if you're able to say that. So I guess, one of the things that I hear more often than anything is, don't you have more important things to work on? Don't you have more important issues to discuss and to address? Because Native Americans have poverty and crime and, violence on the reservations, so why aren't you focused on those issues? And my response to them is, we are working on those things. I mean, those are very important things. That's what I do every single day. But it's also possible to be focused on something that's racist at the same time. And so, in my job, particularly working on the Hill, you walk into offices and the only knowledge that, the senator or whoever it is has of Native American people are Native American mascots, which means you walk in and they look at you like, I thought you people, didn't exist kind of thing, like that's like their actual impression of Native American people. And that's why those mascots to me are very, very harmful. In addition to the studies showing that it hurts children and all that stuff, I think it affects the bottom line because you walk into these places and that's what people think of you. They think you live in a teepee. I get asked that question all the time. And it's like, we're not viewed as modern people and children aren't being taught that in school. They're learning Sitting Bull, Manifest Destiny, and then the Native Americans are gone. There are no Native Americans after that. And so when you're standing there, they're like, what? Like, where did you come from? And it's like, well, we've always been here. So, we're still here and existing. And so I think there's a lot of education that needs to be done. And mascots is a way to push back against that and remove those stereotypes from the general public. I think a lot of people also view Native Americans as, I get asked a lot, why didn't you assimilate? Why didn't you become part of the general society? And my response is, well, we were already here. That's the difference between our narrative and every other narrative of every other race in this country. Everyone else came here, whether it was by force or by decision. They came here and they wanted to be American. We were already here. And so assimilation is just, it's not an option, you know what I mean? That's our culture and that's our heritage, and we are separate entities. And I think people also ask, well, okay, if you didn't assimilate and you live on these reservations with these horrible conditions, why haven't you picked yourself up yet? Like, why are you still in the same place that you were decades ago? And I think a lot of people don't understand that there's this concept of historical trauma, and it's something that is a very, very real living thing. For instance, in my personal family, my grandmother's, her entire generation, they're all living people. They're in their 60s. Were all sent to residential school, where they were taken from their parents and sent to a federally run residential school where horrible things happened. And the same thing happened here in the United States. The boarding school era was a very, very real thing that most people have no idea about. You do not learn about that in history. You do not know that Native Americans went through that. There was the adoption scoop. There was all of these efforts to take us away from our people and to, basically introduce us into society. And so for people to say, well, why haven't you gotten over it yet? I mean, that just happened. That just happened, and you can't expect an entire family structure to re-heal after that. I mean, we're struggling with the loss of our languages, but we're intentionally tried to be killed, right? I mean, and us as people also went through that. So, I mean, I think that it's going to take a lot more than just a decade or two and, here's some money. I mean, that's not how it's going to work. And there's not even that much money, first of all. There's not even that much money. So, I mean, I think it'll take a significant amount. And I think education is huge. If we are recognized as people, I think that'll make it a huge difference in the relationship that we have.
And with what you just said, I remember reading somewhere about Oklahoma. They're trying to change the history classes, and they're trying to make it so they skip over certain topics, like just trying to sweep your history, or people just try to sweep it all under the rug. And I find that very detrimental. I think it's more of a comment, but I think that very detrimental to you're trying to address the issue, and schools are teaching them, the children adolescent age. No. We're different people now. We weren't doing that.
It's particularly disheartening too because it's Oklahoma, which has Cherokee Nation. I mean, that is the largest. You know what I mean? They have such a significant Native American population. So in Washington State, they just passed a law where they actually have to mandatorily teach children in the curriculum about existing Native American tribes and our relationship with the federal government and treaties and fishing rights and all that stuff, which I think will make a huge difference. I mean, you go to Washington, I would guess they're going to know that Native American people still exist and that we don't live in teepees.
Everyone assumes that Native Americans all live on reservations,
and that we all wear headdresses all
right,
the time,
right.
and like I'm just
in this desert.
This metro is
right.
like such a pain in the ass with this huge headdress. I mean,
Exactly.
because they expect you to look a certain way, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they expect you to look like what they picture in their heads.
It's okay.
Can we just answer together, like as a group?
I'm cool with that. And what's your names, by the way? I'm Keenan.
Nice to meet you, Delaney.
Delaney.
Lauren.
So both L's?
Yeah.
All right, I need that. All right, so if you could sign your name. All right, so what I'm going to do is show you both 4 images. Just as a refresher of the context of when people wear those said items and cultural markers and garments. So you each can do one. They're both double-sided, so. So after you looked at it and switched, I will ask you a few questions.
Okay.
All right.
Have you read? Yeah.
It's not going to be a quiz. It's just kind of a refresher. Some people don't
Right.
know when do Jewish men or people that identify with that religion and culture, when do they wear yarmulkes? So it's just a refresher. So question, do you know any Muslim men or women? Personally.
That are women?
Men or women?
Oh.
No, he's
Personally?
not. He's not Muslim. He's a Ebi. He's Pakistani, isn't he?
Yeah.
You could
No.
see. Okay. Do you know anyone who is Jewish? Personally.
Yes.
Okay. Man or woman?
Man.
Okay. Has he ever worn a yarmulke?
No.
No? Okay. Have you ever seen people that are not Jewish that have worn yarmulkes?
Yes.
You have. When did you see them do that?
Mostly at events.
Okay. So flip into this one. So this is a DC perspective film, so I'm eventually going to get to sports. So do you ever see Native Americans or Indigenous, whatever term you want to use, do you ever see Indigenous men or women wearing a headdress or a war bonnet? As
Who
a front
are
row?
actually
Who are actually?
No.
Okay. Have you seen people that are not?
Yes.
Yes.
Where have you seen them?
There's Halloween. There's
Costume
even the
parties.
football team. I've even worn them as a kid when
Yeah,
I
me
was
too.
playing dress up.
Exactly. Yeah. Cowboys and Indians,
Yeah.
all the games that all kids play. Okay, so to the you hit the nail right in the head. So my next question is about the Washington football team.
Right.
So
how do you feel when you see someone wearing a headdress out of context? Do you feel it's just not for me, it's not my battle? Or do you see like, oh, maybe it's just for them to do?
Honestly, until it was brought to my attention that people were wearing all these things that were not of their culture, it never even occurred to me to say anything because I was part of the ignorant group.
Yeah.
So,
That's honestly
but now that I am aware and have become so with the whole Washington Redskins and the everything that is of that thing, I would probably be.
So they're
more
called
vocal
Washington
about it.
Redskins. Have you ever heard someone call an actual indigenous native person a redskin to their face?
No.
Do you think you ever would hear someone say that?
Hopefully not.
Hopefully not. And I find that fascinating because we have a team name and the mascot's an imaginary image that isn't a real person, you know? It's a caricature, it's a drawing that represents the 566 native nations in the U.S. alone. But it's weird that they'll call a mascot, players on the field, redskin, but no one will ever say it to anyone's face. And that kind of lends a little truth to maybe there's a problem.
Yeah.
If I can say it to people that aren't really natives, but I won't say it to a real native person, like then that shows there might be a problem, you know? And I'm trying to, this is the DC perspective, I was born here, you know, I love football, I'm a Ravens fan, but I love football regardless. And I find it fascinating that people, like, oh, I'll never call someone a redskin to their face, but they say hail to the Redskins.
Yeah.
You're not talking about actual real Indians. I just find that very, very interesting.
Actually, I've never heard the term redskin until I heard of the football team. So I would never even just openly say, oh, you're a redskin.
Right.
Like, I would call them Indian, if anything.
Gotcha.
Or Native American.
Thank you both.
That's it?
That is it.
Oh, cool.
That is it.
Can I read these?
Yes, you can. Can't keep it. When you walk into a Native American person wearing that, there's just respect issues, and is it being politically correct? Is it being over the top, or is it just having respect for fellow citizens? Where's the line?
Very interesting.
That's great. Good luck.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. It's perspective, how they dress. So the redskin issue is one of the factors in the recent film.
Redskins regarding what? The football?
Oh, the name. Football, yeah. The football team, and how a lot of Native Americans are against the name. But people that aren't Native Americans own the name. And do you listen to what they say? Do you heed their advice? Or is it fair game that anybody can wear?
There's trademark, isn't it?
Right. Can you put money over over imagery that's not your own people? You know, where do you draw the line? When is it okay? When can other people that aren't of that people group wear those articles of clothing?
Well, if you're in a free society, you want to, it doesn't really matter, right? I mean, as long as you don't disrespect anybody, I think, that shouldn't be an issue.
See, like the headdress, only men can wear it. That's how it was meant. So when Native Americans see women wearing it, it's like, no, you shouldn't wear that.
I just think it's the same as sexuality, though. I mean, somebody wants to be sexuality.
Oh, okay.
Like, if you want to be, if you want to, like Bruce Jenner, for example. With women, we want to be against a man dressing like a woman. That's kind of my comparison.
All right, that's fair enough. Thank you.
No problem.
Keenan, thank you.
All right, no problem.
Thank you.
But yeah, that's how I take it. I mean, as long as you're not insulting or being disrespectful. But I don't think they're being disrespectful. I just think it's more of a media, moneymaker.
There's no money to be made from this.
Well, but the media talks about it and people watch it. So they get commercials out of it,
Right.
And, we're in a society where there's a lot of ignorance, and people believe it. And there are a lot of people that are very resentful, and that's what the media creates, Like CNN and all this stuff. It's just
It does get a little overwhelming seeing the same stories all the time.
Yeah, I just don't, unfortunately I pay for cable, and I'm completely tired, and that's actually what I see. Like, what's CNN today? It's just entertaining, but it's not something that is informative. But that's a society we live in.
So I just want to know, local people, whether it's tourists or just people passing through the lunch break, how do they feel when they see other people wearing cultural sensitive clothes out of context?
If you go to Dubai, you go to Iran, or countries like that, you have to wear the scarf.
Right.
And if you don't wear it, that's disrespectful. But here it's like, I think that being a free society, I mean, I could wear a scarf and I'm not a Muslim.
Right.
If I wanted to. So that's my take on it.
Gotcha.
My 2 cents.
Gotcha. Do you mind if I used everything you've said? Or
No,
is this conversation?
go for it.
Well, let me have to get your signature. Right.
Get out of this crap, man. Don't be I don't know what you're doing really, but
I'm doing a documentary on Indigenous identity.
Indigenous identity. Might be very indigenous.
You want to talk for a few minutes?
What's up? We only got a few minutes.
All right.
Because we're on tour. Are you Secret Service?
He's my detail. Make sure things go well. Yeah. So basically, my documentary is about how we perceive other people. You know, cultural garments. You know, indigenous men wear headdresses in proper context. You know, Muslim women have their headdresses, and people for Halloween feel the need to borrow that appropriation and wear things up without permission. It's that little social without permission. You know, so people wear like a slutty Pocahontas. So this documentary is about how the indigenous population is viewed in the DC area, because the Washington football team, you know, a lot of people want the name changed. So, right.
So, what indigenous? You know, because I feel I'm indigenous.
Sure.
Because I'm a very small part of my thinking is definitely not the same as I think the masses of this country.
Right. Because there's two types of being indigenous. There's ancestrally, where many people have, you know, relatives and a great grandfather, great grandmother that was something. And there's people that have cultural, you know, community involvement. They either live on reservations or stay plugged into their people that they were born from. There's two types. And if you claim either, that's fine, as long as you just keep up and you know your family history. That's all you can ask for, you know.
So what are we doing with this?
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you 4 images. And I want you just to look at them, and then briefly there's just a sum up of the proper context of people of those nations and what they wear. And it's just a reminder, when do people wear yarmulkes, what context, when do Muslim women wear hijabs, you know. And so basically I'm asking about 4 or 5 questions, and the answer is honestly as possible, and that's it. You ready? All right. Questionnaire, I can't tell you how I feel. I don't want to lead the questions.
Yeah, but this is a documentary kind of thing,
right?
And I may be saying something that's
the thing,
hurting my integrity.
Ah, I see. Well, I'll read the questions, and you tell me if you want to answer. All right.
I'm not even sure if I don't like to do. I was just on the travel. They did a show on me on the Travel Channel, and I would not sign the guy's release until I watched him film everything, make sure there was no negative, no
Gotcha.
poopy in there.
Right. So flip into the first, this picture right here. I'm just going to do this picture first. So yarmulke, are you familiar with a kippah, with the proper use of it? You know, men wear it, cover their heads.
I wear one. I'm a Jew.
Okay. Now, do you ever see people that are not Jewish wearing that?
I'm not sure, because I haven't asked every one of them.
Gotcha. But do you generally assume, if you see someone wearing a kippah, that you assume they're Jewish?
No.
You don't assume that?
Because the kippah is worn by many people.
Fair enough. Or people grafted in.
This is one form of kippah. The Muslims also wear. It's not called a kippah.
Right.
There's many cultures that wear this.
Okay. So do you? Is it okay me assuming that you think that people that are like-minded with this faith wear it? I'm just talking about just the Jewish context.
The Jews.
Like, if I told you I wasn't Jewish, would you expect me to ever wear that?
If you felt like it.
If I felt like wearing it? Okay, if I was a religious person?
Then if you're a religious person, if that's what the religion calls for, if you're following that, then probably you would wear that as a Sikh.
Right. Now flip to the other side. Have you ever seen someone who was not indigenous, or anyone in any sporting event? Have you ever seen people wear this out of context? Have you seen women wear this?
You know, I can't say if I've seen a woman. I don't recall, but at the same time, you know, there's many movies.
Right. And those movies aren't, you know, always historically accurate, you know. Right. Because
you know, they're doing something to put stuff in our mind, whether it's for fun or for a cause.
Right.
So what their agenda is, I have no idea why they do it.
Right.
You know, I know a guy who lived on the Hopi reservation. Did he wear exactly this? I don't know that, but I know that he was. You know, when I travel, I rode a camel across India, and when I traveled across India with my camel, I wore the garb. I wore the kurta pajama, sefa, leather shoes.
So with this in mind, how do you feel people wearing it out of context?
I don't know. I mean, why?
The reason why
would I have a feeling? Why would I judge them?
Well, it's not about judging. It's, you know, if
if I'm going to eat sushi, I'm going to use chopsticks. You know, like there's certain things you do with certain things, you know. And women in indigenous communities, there's not a single indigenous community in the nation. There's over 550 nations and tribes. Women are not allowed to wear headdresses. But we see models doing it, we see other people doing it, and it's out of context. And how do you feel about that? Do you feel if they want to wear it, that's okay? Or do you feel, hey, if you're not indigenous, if you're not a man, you shouldn't wear it?
Look, because this community called the United States that we're living in, and they're trying to throw everything into this big mix, like the biggest melting pot in history.
Right.
That is their agenda, is to let everything go array. Everything, just whatever you want to do it, look weird, and do whatever you want to do, but make sure you stay within the boundaries of our laws that we want to, that we put on you. But as long as you're paying attention to the law and paying the money and the taxes, then other than that, hey, you guys just corrupt this country the best you can. Hey, matter of fact, when you leave the country, go outside and throw our American ways over there too. But if you're in this society and that's their laws or their beliefs, then personally I would respect it and I would not do things to make them upset. Why would I? There are people that probably do it for whatever weird reason, the same as people do whatever they're doing for weird reasons and superpowers and stuff.
So last question, do you follow the Washington football team? The Redskins?
No, I don't.
No. How do you feel about the term Redskin? As a word, as describing someone, because African Americans, black, they wanted to be called black. That was their prerogative, they wanted it. We have a lot of Native Americans in the majority.
Oh, they switched it around. I think they've switched it around.
But we're not Negro anymore. They've evolved from one word to another.
You said that right there, evolved.
Right.
Okay, or evolved or changed, or one person may be profiting out of that, the NAACP or whoever. Okay, we want to be called this today.
Right.
We were called that before, but today we want to be that. And you know what? In 5 years, the black folk will be called another one, or the First Nation will. They didn't want to be called Indian. They wanted to be whatever. Now it's First Nation. Hey, more power to them, man. And more power to anybody who wants it. But there may be hidden agendas in there. Who am I to know?
Love poem in American. To nurture something is no small thing. Taking care of something you deem as important, holding it close. The first time you lay eyes on that beloved, you keep it in your heart, you caress it, you love it, you cherish it. You watch it grow into the thing you want it to be. Attention to the subtle nuances, the way his hair flows, the way her skin looks in the sun. To know them with a surety, to understand the mind, the thoughts, the reasons. To honor those things with every fiber of your being, to hold them up with adoring love and affection, to never let them go, to speak their words so that they may not be lost in the romance of your heart. To care, to carry, to sustain your strong arms embraced in your love, completely enveloped in your compassion, standing with the surety of your understanding. You know them like you know yourself. And now that they're gone, you love them more. You enshrine them with the pure image, the picture of perfection, strength, honor, nobility, wisdom, tradition, beauty, majesty. My feather headdress wearing, loincloth girding, redskin, romance novel hair blowing, dances with Daniel Day Costner, Lone Ranger, Tonto, love child, Cleveland Indian. I love you forever.
I've been searching more than I could tell, but I know that I mean well. I've been holding on to something false, and I know I can find my way. I just need to break down, watch it all just burn to the ground. I may need to break down so I can hold on to something real. I've been searching all around.